Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about one of the most significant developments in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Military analysts are saying that Crimea, once seen as Russia's most secure stronghold, is now increasingly exposed. The situation is shifting fast, and many experts believe that what happens in Crimea next could redefine the balance of power in the region. For nearly a decade, Russia has treated Crimea as untouchable. Since the annexation in 2014, it has served as a base for projecting power into the Black Sea, hosting major airfields, naval installations, and command centers. Moscow poured billions into fortifications, logistics, and infrastructure, building what it considered a fortress peninsula. But time, technology, and war have a way of reshaping even the strongest strongholds. The first thing analysts point out is geography. Crimea is a peninsula linked to mainland Russia by a single main route, the Kerch Bridge, and otherwise surrounded by sea. What once provided natural defense now creates vulnerability. Any disruption to the bridge or maritime routes cuts supply lines, leaving Russian forces isolated. Over the past 2 years, several attacks on the Kerch Bridge have proven how fragile that lifeline really is. Each strike rattled not just logistics, but also the illusion of control. Satellite images and open-source intelligence show that Russian forces have been working around the clock to dig trenches, install minefields, and reinforce northern Crimea with defensive lines, stretching for miles. These preparations suggest one thing clearly: Russia no longer sees Crimea as safe. Defensive work is not a show of strength but an admission of risk. Ukraine's improving capabilities have changed the equation dramatically. Long-range drones, cruise missiles, and Western-supplied systems have made it possible for Ukraine to strike deep into the peninsula. Russian air bases, fuel depots, and radar stations that were once beyond reach are now targets. Several explosions across Crimea, some confirmed, others likely covert operations, have disrupted Russia's logistics, intelligence, and morale. In 2022 and 2023, attacks on Sevastopol's naval headquarters and Seki Air Base showed that the Black Sea Fleet was not beyond reach. Footage of burning ships and damaged aircraft undermined Russia's claim that Crimea was fully secure. Each hit carried not just tactical value, but psychological weight, showing that Ukrainian forces could threaten even Russia's most prized territory. Another key factor is logistics. Crimea depends heavily on supplies coming through the Kerch Bridge and the northern corridor from occupied parts of southern Ukraine. With increased Ukrainian pressure on those routes, Russia faces constant difficulty maintaining consistent supply chains. If those links are cut or degraded, large parts of its military presence in Crimea could become unsustainable. Analysts often describe Crimea as both a jewel and a trap. It offers tremendous strategic advantages: control of the Black Sea, access to maritime trade routes, and proximity to southern Ukraine. But it's also isolated and hard to resupply under pressure. Holding Crimea requires enormous resources, especially in a war that has stretched Russian logistics thin across multiple fronts. Modern warfare has also evolved in ways that expose Crimea further. Drones, satellite surveillance, and precision weapons make it nearly impossible to hide assets or rely on distance as protection. Russia's naval and air facilities, once believed to be out of range, can now be monitored, targeted, and attacked with increasing accuracy. Ukraine doesn't need to occupy Crimea to make it strategically costly. It only needs to make it difficult and expensive for Russia to keep it. Another aspect is morale. Reports from Crimea suggest unease among both Russian troops and local populations. Continuous explosions, curfews, and tightened security create a climate of fear and uncertainty. Civilians see military installations under threat, and soldiers station there face constant drone and missile attacks. For a force meant to feel invincible, that psychological strain is significant. Analysts emphasize that the war in Ukraine is not just about territory, but about perception. Russia has long portrayed Crimea as an inseparable part of its territory, a symbol of power and legitimacy. Any visible weakness there strikes at the heart of that narrative. Every successful Ukrainian attack chips away at Russia's image of control, sending a message both to domestic audiences and the international community. From Ukraine's perspective, targeting Crimea carries both symbolic and strategic importance. It demonstrates reach, defiance, and momentum. Even if Kiev cannot immediately retake the peninsula, showing it can disrupt Russian operations there boosts morale across Ukraine and strengthens Western confidence in Ukrainian resilience. Crimea's exposure also has international implications. The Black Sea has become one of the most heavily militarized bodies of water in the world. NATO closely monitors the region, while Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria assess how shifts in Crimea affect maritime security. If Russian dominance in the Black Sea declines, it could open new avenues for Ukraine and its allies to secure trade routes and energy corridors. Another important detail is how the conflict in Crimea interacts with broader Russian military planning. Analysts note that every battalion, missile battery, and anti-air system committed to defending Crimea is one less that can be used elsewhere. Russia's need to reinforce the peninsula diverts troops and resources from other fronts. Even if Ukraine doesn't launch a full-scale assault, keeping Crimea under constant threat forces Russia into a defensive posture. The cost of defending Crimea has become enormous. Maintaining air defenses, repairing infrastructure, and sustaining garrisons requires constant expenditure. With sanctions and economic strain already affecting Russia, the long-term sustainability of such a heavy commitment is questionable. The peninsula may eventually become more of a liability than an asset. Analysts also point to the growing intelligence war in Crimea. Covert sabotage, espionage, and local resistance movements have made the region unpredictable. Ukraine's intelligence services have successfully conducted operations targeting collaborators and supply depots. These incidents add another layer of instability to an already pressured environment. Even Russia's naval position in the Black Sea has weakened. After multiple successful Ukrainian strikes on ships and ports, the Black Sea Fleet reportedly relocated some vessels to safer harbors. That move is symbolic. It means Russia no longer feels confident keeping its fleet in Sevastopol, once the pride of its southern navy. The gradual withdrawal signals a recognition of Crimea's vulnerability. At the same time, the political weight of Crimea remains heavy. Vladimir Putin has built much of his legitimacy on reclaiming and defending the peninsula. Any threat to Crimea challenges the narrative of strength that underpins his leadership. That makes the peninsula not just a military asset, but a political one, deeply tied to the image of Russian power. Losing it, or even appearing unable to protect it, would have far-reaching implications for Russia's domestic politics. Ukraine understands this dynamic well. Its leadership frequently states that the war will not truly end until Crimea is liberated. Even if that goal remains distant, Maintaining pressure keeps Crimea in the spotlight. It prevents Russia from consolidating gains elsewhere and ensures the world's attention stays on the illegitimacy of the 2014 annexation. As the war evolves, the technological landscape adds new layers of risk for Russia. Western supplied weapons like long-range precision missiles, combined with Ukraine's domestically produced drones, mean that nowhere in Crimea is truly out of reach. Air defenses are constantly on alert, and reports suggest shortages of interceptor missiles. Each successful Ukrainian strike forces Russia to disperse assets and reinforce defenses yet again. This cat and mouse dynamic increases fatigue on both sides, but it favors the attacker. Ukraine doesn't need to hold ground in Crimea. It only needs to keep the pressure steady. Over time, attrition, logistical, psychological, and political, could erode Russia's ability to maintain control. For now, analysts agree that a large-scale Ukrainian offensive into Crimea is unlikely in the short term. The cost, terrain, and fortifications make it extremely difficult. However, the strategy of gradual degradation is already showing results. Repeated attacks on depots, radar systems, and command posts have forced Russia to spread its forces thin and rethink its posture. Beyond the military sphere, the population of Crimea itself is facing uncertainty. Russian settlers, local collaborators, and Crimean Tatars live under the shadow of war. Reports indicate rising tension and movement restrictions as authorities fear internal sabotage. In the long run, these social fractures could weaken Russia's administrative control, creating further instability. Another factor is the growing isolation of Crimea from the rest of the world. Sanctions, disrupted tourism, and restricted trade have turned what was once a popular resort destination into a militarized zone. Economic stagnation undermines morale and increases resentment among residents. When combined with ongoing strikes and the constant military presence, the environment becomes one of quiet unrest rather than stability. From a purely strategic perspective, analysts now describe Crimea as a vulnerable forward operating base rather than a safe haven. Its exposure to attack makes it both crucial and dangerous. Russia must hold it for prestige and practical reasons, but every step it takes to protect it reveals more about its weaknesses. Over the next year, the situation will likely intensify. Ukraine's continued acquisition of long-range systems and the expansion of drone warfare will make it harder for Russia to protect its assets. Every new layer of defense comes at a cost, while Ukraine's asymmetric strategy remains comparatively cheaper and more flexible. If Crimea continues to be struck with regularity, Russia's ability to use it as a logistics hub could collapse. That would not necessarily mean losing the peninsula outright, but it would greatly diminish its military utility. Ships could be forced to relocate, air bases could become too dangerous to operate, and supply chains could face constant disruption. At that stage, analysts predict Russia would face a dilemma: double down and pour more resources into Crimea, or gradually scale back to protect core fronts. Either path carries risk. Pouring in resources could overextend the military. Scaling back could be perceived as weakness. This strategic bind is precisely why experts say Crimea is now exposed. The psychological impact of losing control over Crimea's narrative could be profound. For nearly a decade, the Kremlin has presented it as a symbol of national unity and restoration. If Ukraine continues to strike with impunity, that symbol erodes. The loss of confidence, both internally and internationally, would ripple through Russian political discourse. Meanwhile, for Ukraine, each successful strike boosts morale. It reinforces the idea that no territory seized by force is safe from counteraction. This message matters not only to Ukrainians, but to allies providing support, demonstrating that Western weapons and strategies yield results keeps international momentum alive. Analysts also note that Russia's reliance on traditional defense doctrines makes adaptation slower. Modern drone warfare and decentralized command structures favor Ukraine's more agile tactics. Crimea, with its fixed bases and long supply lines, is ill-suited for this new kind of warfare. The longer the war drags on, the more this mismatch becomes apparent. If current trends continue, Crimea could become a contested zone rather than a stable base. Russian dominance in the Black Sea would weaken, and Ukraine could open safer routes for grain exports and maritime trade. This would mark a strategic shift not only in the war but in regional geopolitics, affecting Turkey, Romania, and even the Mediterranean balance. For now, though, the struggle over Crimea remains primarily one of endurance. Russia must convince its population and military that the peninsula is secure, while Ukraine must keep proving that it isn't. Each missile strike, drone attack, or intelligence leak feeds that ongoing battle of perception. In the end, what analysts mean when they say Crimea is now exposed is that the balance of power has shifted. The fortress image is fading. The peninsula that once symbolized permanent control now represents constant vulnerability. The illusion of security has cracked under the pressure of modern warfare, economic strain, and relentless Ukrainian determination. How this story ends remains uncertain, but one thing is clear: Crimea will continue to be the center of gravity in this conflict. Its fate could determine not just the outcome of the war, but the future of security in Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region. So, as we watch the situation unfold, remember that what happens in Crimea matters far beyond its borders. It's a test of resilience, strategy, and political will on both sides. The exposure analysts are talking about is not just physical, it's symbolic of how even the most powerful nations can find their strengths turned into vulnerabilities. Thanks for watching. If you found this analysis useful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more updates, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Crimea can still remain under Russian control, or has the tide already begun to turn? Let's talk about it.